Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
The thing you might be anticipating today that you're like, oh, I probably should change this up right now. Oh, I'll see how it goes. Most of the time my experience is like, no, I probably should have done that. But when you're a first-time CEO, you haven't been through the process before.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Learning about our customers and developing products based on their needs is simple to understand, but kind of complicated to execute when you balance those customer desires against what's good for your shareholders and business and what your team can build and operate. On this episode, I get to hang out with Jim Simpson. Jim and I have a good amount in common, like how early in our lives we both learned to write code, how we're both third culture children, and how both of our careers landed in product management by way of computer science and software engineering. We get to also talk about how he learned how to code early after making a really tough choice between a Commodore 64 or an Atari for a birthday present, and how when he spent time in Japan as a child of military personnel, that experience really led for him to learn a lot about open-mindedness, adaptability, and the concept of identity that have really helped him with leading product teams and leading a company. We covered how he became a product manager after roles in computer programming and UX design, and then went on to lead the product team at Duo Security, who had a massively successful exit to Cisco. Now, y'all know how much time I spend obsessing about recruiting the right teams and enabling that talent the right way. And I'm glad that Jim and I got to talk about Jim's observations around hiring product managers, taking chances that paid off and some that didn't. And we got real nerdy talking about how we balance the various constraints between the customers, the business, compliance, technology, operations to build great product roadmaps. Jim is now the CEO of Blumira, where he brings a product mindset to the cybersecurity SaaS company, and he took this role over directly from the founders. Hope you enjoy the episode. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube.
I'm a military brat. My dad was in the Marine Corps and he was drafted before I was born, and he was still in the military after I graduated from college, to give you an idea of how long that was. And because of that, we moved a lot as a family when I was growing up. That kind of life experience can be really formative in terms of being able to adapt to change and new experiences. And probably the most formative experience I had was the last place my dad was stationed before I moved to Michigan to go to school was Okinawa, Japan. And when I learned that we were moving to Japan, I started studying the language and trying to understand where I was going, and then benefited from our family living off base initially for our first year. So my first friends in Japan were all native Japanese kids, and so I learned how to swear, talk about candy and video games before I learned any sort of appropriate Japanese. But that opened up a whole new world to me, and in particular, my parents never gave me a curfew and kind of let me run wild in Japan. And when we reconnected about it, decades later, I was like, so why did you let me do that? And they're like, well, there was great public transportation and it's the safest country on the planet and you kind of stick out. So if you got lost, we were pretty sure that someone would bring you home.
Okay. So before we get into your career as an engineer in college in Michigan, I want to know a little bit more about Japan. I didn't live in Japan, but a lot of my career was influenced by working at a Japanese plant, and that's where I learned lean and other things like that. It's such a beautiful culture, so different from here. So I'm curious to know, what are some of the biggest takeaways you think you maybe learned there when you came back to the States and you were surrounded by more of an American-centric population?
Yeah, you might have heard the term third culture kid. It's somebody who lives between, you might be one yourself. You live between these two cultures. Yeah. And you never quite fit into either one of them. And you see both the beauty in them and the challenges in them. And coming back to this country, or to the States, the thing that actually was kind of wild was how I saw myself not necessarily as an American. And when I would speak to other Japanese people, I would use, like when I would talk about Japan, I would use the verb kaeru, which is to return, as opposed to iku, which is to go. And they would look at me like, kaeru, like, you're not Japanese, like, you're not returning to anything. And I'd be like, what do you mean? Like, that's where I'm from, right? So that right there was something that kind of stood out to me, where it really made me think about identity in a way that I'd never considered it before. Because here in the States, mainstream America, kind of the default is like the white male. And so when you suddenly have that put in your face at a young age, you realize, oh, wait, maybe I'm not the center of the universe. And what are the implications of that? And how do I move through the world in a way that takes that into account? So I learned that lesson maybe a little bit earlier than some of my counterparts. And, the further I get in, my own life now, and especially in these days, I see how that, is really, really important to take into consideration as we move through the world and understanding each other and trying to make things happen as we become more of a global community. And I just feel very fortunate that I had that experience a bit earlier. I will say that the white privilege didn't, one of the benefits of it was when I was in Japan, clearly being a gaijin and doing strange things, it never kept me from trying them out. So, sometimes assuming that you do great things all the time is beneficial to taking big risks. And so if I can turn that around, one of the things that I think about a lot based on my experiences, how do I help others see that who may actually be coming from a less advantaged background, and sort of helping them find the way, because I did it somewhere else by virtue of luck and, sheer will. But it's like, that's not the only way that, people can find success in the world. Like sometimes they need a little bit of help or assistance, and how can I take advantage of some of these things I've had? I think the other thing that really stands out to me about growing up in Japan was the community-oriented approach to many things. And some of that might come from it being a monoculture. One of the challenges we have in the US is we have a lot of people from different backgrounds, and that can lead to conflict and disagreement. But I often think that the US is just the first place where many of these kinds of things happen, because it is one of the first places where people from different backgrounds have come to live together. And so when you have a monoculture, sometimes it's easier to be a community because you all think and look, at things the same way. But they do it out of necessity in Japan. There's not enough land, not everybody can have everything. And so by default, they're always thinking about more in like a sort of group oriented way. And we here are a lot more, thinking about ourselves and independence. And so that's something I still haven't quite reconciled. I think, benefits to both in both places. But it's something that definitely informs how I move through the world and move through my organization and my career and all of those things. And I'm grateful to have both sides of that experience to bring to bear.
That's amazing. I mean, you guessed correctly. I am also a third culture kid, Indian family, and I was raised in the Middle East in a few different countries there. And, monoculture is maybe more of a spectrum than a binary. It was definitely a very diverse population in Muscat, where I spent from 7 to 17, and definitely can resonate with a lot around having this community centricity versus self-centricity, acting in service of others, around encouraging them to take risks, and kind of extending some of those things that maybe are in your mindset from the privilege that you have. I love it. So let's zoom back then. You're in computer science class. I learned how to code when I was fairly young. In my case, is because my dad's an engineer, software engineer. So it was kind of almost like playing video games to do like QBasic or something for my brothers and I. How did you get into it? Why did you want to go into it? How did you pick that course? Yeah.
Okay. So this is a fun story. So I think when I was about 8 years old, my father came home, and it was, my birthday's around Thanksgiving, and, Christmas is right around the corner. So on occasion, my parents would do this thing where they would kind of double up the holiday, and I could get a big thing. And he came home with a $100 bill, which is very exciting. And he said, you have a choice. We can either purchase an Atari or a Commodore 64. And I was,
Tough choice.
I was like 8 years old. I was like, oh my gosh, like, what do I do here? Because the Atari would be really great. And like everyone, that's really awesome. And I really want to play video games at home. But I chose to go for the Commodore 64, partially because I knew you could put cartridges into it and also play video games, but partially because I knew like I could make things with it and I wanted that start. And, when I was 13, we got our first PC compatible because I was like, this Commodore 64 thing isn't really going to get me anywhere at this point. And, my parents wanted to do word processing at home. So we went out and got this monochrome monitor behemoth of what sounded like a jet engine. And, I started playing with that. And coincidentally, this is when we lived in Japan. I had an opportunity at my high school. There was a computer lab there, which is, I think, pretty novel for the time because they had like the typing rooms where people learned to type, but we actually had a computer lab that was separate from that. And because they still taught people on actual typewriters back then. And you could take one class, which is basic. So I took the one programming and basic class and I went to the teacher and I was like, hey, I want to learn more. What can I do? And it turns out like, this is a DOD school, Department of Defense Dependent School, and they had a consortium that actually worked with the University of Michigan where you could take distance learning classes through the University of Michigan, at a high school. And so what was really cool is like my last 2 years of high school in Japan, I was taking, I took Pascal and I think C programming courses remotely. My teacher was was based in Germany. And then we were transacting all of the coursework through the Michigan Terminal System, which was like the predecessor that the University of Michigan used to use for like email and like sharing of data back in the day. And I had no idea that someday I would end up at the University of Michigan. It just was this thing I would log into to upload my coursework, chat with people, download things. But I think the other thing that was like super cool about it that really stuck with me is it was independent learning. And so I had to have a sponsor, but basically it was on me that full hour to do whatever I wanted to do. And sometimes I'd be really clever and I would schedule that hour against my lunch hour. And so I would have a 2-hour lunch hour and I would like leave school and I would go off and do something else inside of, Okinawa. And as I had a computer at home, so I could just get my coursework done at home, put it on a floppy and upload it when I went to school. So that also was like, that really planted the seed of, I think like, independence, like being kind of entrepreneurial. And then also again, like doing it through something that I loved because I could program as easily as I could stick in, a video game, into the computer and play that when I got bored with programming. So that's kind of like where it started. And I think a lot of people, when they go into school, they're like, I want to be this thing. And I really didn't have like strong conviction about it. It was more like, can I continue studying this thing? And like, turns out I could.
So you kind of made the choice to be a creator as well and not just a consumer in that choice. And it's kind of like asking the genie for 3 more wishes in a way. After engineering school, it sounds like you found your way into working in UX, found your way working in product.
Yeah. So when I graduated, I found this interesting little startup called Nonlinear Dynamics, like the longest name ever. Can you imagine like Simpson at nonlineardynamics.com? That was a fun email address to type in. But we were doing government contract work for some pretty interesting skunkworks stuff and also working on problems like drug discovery for the big pharmaceutical companies. And we were trying to use what everybody understands now as AI to expedite drug discovery and other kind of interesting things on a contract basis. And what ended up happening is, I was a decent enough programmer. It was my first job. I also had the ability to talk to customers. So, we would have our programmers like making something for them to use, but like sometimes it wouldn't be what they were looking for. And I found when I was in the room, I could have a conversation with the person who was going to use the product and figure out like, well, how could we like actually make this work in such a way that is better for them. And at the time, this was the late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't talk about UX at that point. We talked about UI. We used the word like holistic user interface because we were thinking about somebody who could not only build a user interface, but that person could, test the user interface from a usability perspective. They could design the user interface. They could, talk to a customer. So it was like this, the entire scope of what eventually became user experience. And I found that I loved it. It was really rewarding to go in and essentially like put a product in front of a customer, see where it fell down, see where it worked, and then take that back to the team and say like, hey, here's what we've discovered. How do you think we can solve this and make it better? And I really loved the facilitation of that kind of work, because it was not like I'm the person who's going to solve the problem. It was more like, I'm going to find a way to bring context back to my team so that we can come together and solve it together, which really was hitting on that like community oriented thing that I look for in terms of like how I move through the world. And so the next logical step for me was to move into product management. I got a lucky break where one of my former colleagues, Doug Song, had started a company called Duo Security in Ann Arbor. And he and I had been talking off and on over the years about, because we'd known each other since college, about, what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. And he understood my passion for getting into product management. And he laid down a challenge. He's like, hey, so if you can go get a job offer from another company to be a product manager, we will, hire you to be our product manager. And I was like, just hire me to be the product manager? Like, you kind of know I'm good, right? And at the time, like, it seemed a little annoying to go through that process. But in retrospect, I really appreciate it, because it absolved Doug of nepotism, which, being a CEO myself now, I understand the value in like being able to say, no, this person can stand on their own. I didn't hire them just because I know them, right? And that really was the start of, where I came to today. And, I was good at talking to customers and figuring things out with customers, but I didn't understand the business side of it and like why we would do these things. And product management was a really great way to start to understand and contextualize that. And then also help broader groups of people create something together. So when you're working in user experience, oftentimes you're paired with, designers and engineers, but you're not necessarily like working with, the marketing team or the sales team and getting as much exposure as you do to the go-to-market side of the house. And in product management, I definitely did. Initially, I definitely was like, what is the value of whether these people over here? They seem kind of insane. But, at this point, it's not, I recognize it's not the best product that wins. It's the best product with like the best marketing and the best sales that actually like sees the day. And being in product management is what gave me that purview. And again, when I joined, I wasn't a good product manager. I'd never done it before. And I was also very fortunate in that Doug recognized that he was taking a chance on me, and he understood the cost of what we would now call inclusion. And I don't mean necessarily like on an ethnicity basis, but like when you but there's a high correlation with diversity and equity inclusion and the cost of inclusion. So what I mean by that is like a lot of times, if somebody's never done something before, you have to figure out how to like make them, be successful. And some of that is you're going to have to pay up front if you're bringing in somebody with less experience. And again, that was a lesson I carried with me as I built out my team in the future, when it was like, hey, I'm interviewing a variety of different kinds of people. These people have the same capability. This person's done it before. This person hasn't, but I think they could both be, successful. If I have the ability to take that chance on that person and actually like create more equity in the world, I'm going to do that. I'm fully understanding that there's like a cost to it, because again, somebody in my career like gave me that opportunity when I couldn't find it otherwise, and took that chance on me and showed me both through the work, but also the support network of what it could be like when you give people that chance. And so that kind of got me into the product management world. And frankly, that was the happiest I'd ever been in my career at that point. It was amazing. I really loved what I did when I was at Duo and the team there.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Product managers, we're starting to be able to study it at school now, but most of us that have done it in the last 5, 10, 15 years have had to kind of learn it on the job in some capacity. So I'm curious if you were to, and maybe you've already done this, so the business acumen side, especially for folks who maybe haven't gone through an MBA or worked in sales or worked kind of closer to the business side, coming in from the technical or UX ranks. What do you kind of give them advice, or what do you send them to go read or do to get a sense of the business side of things to help with their product roles?
So the two things that immediately come to mind from go out and learn is pragmatic marketing. It is a really great baseline framework to get your feet wet in product and understand the discipline of product. And they have a number of different specialties inside of it now. They've, I think, changed the courses twice since, I first started in it. But that gave me a baseline framework for how to think about product and how to understand the different things that product does. And so when somebody's getting their feet wet in product, I'm always like, okay, here's the best place to start. But the thing is you don't have to do all of it. There were two big takeaways from pragmatic marketing. The first was the cute phrase nihito, which stood for nothing important happens in the office. And the idea there was you need to go out and talk to customers and find out what your customers want. And if you can do that, then you will win, because you'll solve their problems and then they'll be happy to give you money for that. I think the other thing, which is tightly paired with that, which actually gets into Buddhist principles, which is again something I love, is your opinion, while interesting, is irrelevant. So basically the idea is that if you want to be a really good product manager, swallow your ego, destroy your ego, figure out what it is that your customers want. It's not because you're the best thinker. It's because you're able to synthesize enough information with a broader team to create something that actually solves a real problem in the world. That's when you get to do really great product management. And pragmatic marketing, was really good at illustrating those fundamentals, and then also helping to understand what are the different roles in a product group, product marketing versus product management versus product strategy, and where you might start and then, slowly build. The other coursework that I like is Silicon Valley Product Group, where I look at pragmatic marketing as the arithmetic and algebra of product, and I look at SVPG as kind of the calculus of it, where you sort of learn the shortcuts to evaluate and figure things out. When it comes to the operating side of things, the most important thing for me when I was working in product management and starting my career was around talking to customers. And so when I was at Duo, I think when I started there, we had around 100 customers.
And how big was the Duo team around that time?
We were about 10 people. I was employee number 7. So we had a PLG type SaaS website from the very beginning. And so we were fortunate enough to have some customers, even though we didn't have a sales and marketing team. And again, pragmatic marketing, they were what you need to do, you need to make friends with 10 of your customers and then go talk to them all the time. And so I did exactly that. And then when we started to get sales and marketing, I found myself being asked to go on calls with them. And I remember being a little bit itchy about this because I'm how am I going to get my work done? But what I ended up doing was realizing it was an opportunity to talk to prospective customers about, what they were trying to solve by talking to us, but then also what other problems did they have? And so that to me, gave me a lot more customer empathy, but it also gave me empathy for the sales and the marketing teams in terms of what were the challenges that they were facing in terms of like how to sell the product and how to market the product. And so what could I do from a product management perspective to prioritize things that would actually like continue to drop those barriers to just make it easier and easier for them to get through that process to get to whatever thing that, maybe we couldn't solve and they could have a more meaningful conversation about.
I had a very similar background where as I was transitioning from engineering to product, it was a small enough company that it was really hard to not be around the customers. And then I realized I really liked it. And one of the challenges I noticed around PMs these days is there's usually like a hesitation around leaving the building or picking up the phone, calling the customer. That's for sales sort of thing. I'm curious to know if you've experienced that yourself or any tips or advice on how to coach people to overcome some of that self-speak.
I mean, I personally don't experience like a dread to get out of the building. I mean, I don't really have a building, but like I like working with people now. Like I never thought of myself as an extrovert or a people person, but I think I was just like a closeted extrovert that, product management finally was like, oh, actually you're really good at talking to people. But what I did when I was building out the product management team at Duo was I created metrics for it. So there was a very strong metric where it was like, you are going to meet, in person with at least 10 customers this quarter, and you're going to have at least one phone call or, some kind of back and forth with a customer via email or some other mechanism. And then you're going to distill at least 5 of those and you're going to write them up and then you're going to send them out to an email distribution that people can opt into inside of our company to hear about what customers have to say. So I just made it part of like the job duty is like, you're going to do this. And, at that point had already built templates to help people figure out like what to do when they went out on a call with a customer. So they weren't like necessarily flying blind. And also as I onboarded people, there would be times where I would go with them, and then help the rest of the organization understand that you don't have to talk to me alone anymore. There's actually a team of us, and get to know some of them because, now there's like 500 of you and one of me, and I can't be on every phone call, but like now we have 10 p.m. So like meet your team. But, along the way, it was like trying to get people into this idea of like, this is what normal looks like. This is how you do it. And, I've noticed that, people like I've seen it, I think it was common then and it's still common now. It's like people by default, they want to try to solve the problem as quickly as possible. And what I mean by that is like, sometimes it's easier to just go talk to an account executive, a salesperson about what the customer said. But, one of the other takeaways from the pragmatic marketing framework was an idea about how you can do prioritization in an objective way. And they have a pretty interesting equation in there, which is, the priority is the impact times the evidence. And you as a product team can decide what the impact is. And typically it's like a 0 to 5, where 5 is like, the product is broken, or maybe our, number one competitor has it. And 0 is like, there is no impact by building whatever this thing is. And then if you have to force a priority, you can have like a 999. And then for your evidence, you decide how that wants to work. And so what we decided was, an internal voice talking about a feature would count as a 1. But if a customer spoke about a feature, it would count as a 5. If we saw us being compared in a magazine that we didn't have this thing, that would be a 2. And so basically you sum up all of the evidence you get on feature requests versus the impact. So if you have a whole bunch of evidence for something that has 0 impact, guess what? It's still a 0. And that gives you a first take on like, what are the priorities? And then you as the product manager can sort of look at that list and go, okay, well, based on this, quantitative analysis, what do I know qualitatively based on my customers' conversations that I can then take to the next stage and talk to other teams in the organization to figure out how to take it to the next level. And that was also a forcing function to get people to go out there and talk to customers, because we would always weight that kind of data a lot more heavily in figuring out the priority and demonstrate to the rest of the organization that the customer's voice counts. And this is actually how it manifests itself objectively inside of our practice.
As a consultant, I naturally think in 2x2s, and you've got your impact and evidence there. And in the cases where you have low evidence but high impact, or an assumption of high impact, did that also influence sort of experiments or more conversations that got prioritized in terms of what to have? And then were there anything beyond contextual interviews? Were there experiments like Wizard of Oz, anything else that you might have done to really get some high level of confidence?
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling already because I'm thinking about, like, we got better at experiments as we went along. Sometimes experiments were like, we actually built something, put it out there, saw it fail, and then we're like, maybe we shouldn't have done that. I'm really happy to say that, like, later on, we learned how to run experiments in a much more lightweight fashion, largely because of some of the things that we learned from the Silicon Valley product group, where it's like, if you really want to test whether or not a customer is going to pay for something, create a beta feature of it and see how many of them opt into it. And, oh, wow, if you get like an opt-in rate above a certain percent, maybe you can start taking it to the next level with some wireframes, get on the phone with them, and then figure out, like, how do they want this thing to actually work, and would they actually pay any kind of money for it? Sometimes, even when you build this quantitative, objective way of looking at priority, you also, from a business perspective, have to be looking at a much bigger picture than just the customer voice. So the customer voice should be really loud and inform how you're building things, how you're solving problems. But on occasion, when you're a VC-backed startup, you will have some other things that you're trying to achieve. Like, for example, maybe you want to close your first $1 million customer, and they need one feature to do so. And if you're able to close them, then you get that logo and you get a case study, and that helps you actually build the company out so that you can service more customers. And so this is just like one lens to start looking at it. But then you also have to be looking at, like, well, what is the overall big picture and the goal of the company? And what are we trying to do? Because if you're working at a startup, you're not trying to get to the finish line first. What you're trying to do is get the company to the next stage so that you then have the opportunity to get to the next stage. And ideally, you have some idea of what, like, the finishing stage looks like. But most of the time in a VC-backed company, it's a years-long process. And so those things also, are factored into thinking about, how to use priority, which is why, for me, the quantitative way of doing it is just a first pass to, like, allow you to, like, drive conversations with, in the leadership inside of the company, but then also, like, some of the customers to really understand, like, hey, is this really important for us to do this? I think one other thing to consider too is, like, we would also have internal requests on how to, fix the product to maybe drive down the number of technical support tickets on a certain issue. And sometimes it's a really painful conversation because, it's the number one thing that, like, maybe the tech support team is dealing with all the time, and they're getting hundreds of them a week. And then you go off into engineering land, you're like, oh, we should probably fix that. And then you quantify how much time would it take to fix that. And you find out, oh my gosh, it's going to take like 6 months, and it's going to be $1 million spend to fix it. So then you get to go back to the tech support team, and you're like, okay, so it's like 100 a week, but, like, how much time do we spend on it? Oh, we're spending a cumulative amount of 1 hour a week on it, even though it's 100 things. So that 1 hour a week, let's see here, costs us how much? Okay, so it's a $5,000 problem that we're going to spend like $1 million to solve. Maybe we just have to keep doing it this way manually. And someday when we are working on that area of the product where we can solve that problem, we'll just sort of dovetail it nicely onto there. But, like, that's the other thing that, you deal with in product management, is that you're doing these trade-offs that are not always visible or obvious to other parts of the organization, because you're trying to manage the system as a whole and not necessarily, like, through one specific lens. And that is both the blessing and the challenge of being in product management, is you get all that visibility, but sometimes you don't have the ability to explain to all of your stakeholders, like, why you've made the decision that you've made, because either you make the decision and execute, or you spend all of your time explaining why you didn't choose the 90 other things that other people wanted, right?
There's certainly some kind of brain wiring that is routed better to be able to hold that many different variables and constraints, and at least have your instincts informed that can then go towards that quantitative approach. I also love that the quantitative approach is just the first pass, because then you're not struggling to get high levels of precision on that quantification. You're okay with a little bit of margin of error because it's just the first pass. So I think that'll help you go a lot faster too. Bringing it back to the brain wiring, I'm curious to know, given that PMs come from different backgrounds and we're usually making some level of judgment call like Doug did with you if they haven't worked as a PM before. Do you have any biases or weaknesses for any sort of adjacent traits around folks who might be good at PMs?
There's sort of like my idealistic view of the world and then the practical things that I've seen. What I would say is like the best product managers I've seen come from the technical side of the house. Typically, they are either former engineers who have an ability and a desire to connect and communicate with other people. So I think all engineers are smart, but it's like, if you want to be a good product manager, you have to actually want to go and talk to people. And in my experience, many engineers are like, I really don't want to be in meetings. Like, meetings are terrible. It's like, if you are kind of anti-meeting, you probably should not be a product manager ever. And then there's also solution engineers, which are typically the folks who are bridging the gap on the sales side between the product and a prospective customer. And, I see a lot more inbound from that. And the first question I typically ask is like, why do you want to be the product manager? And a really good answer is when they are interested in solving customer problems and, want to learn more about how to do that. The more common thing I hear is like, if I'm the product manager, then we will make the right decisions in the company. And for me, I'm like, okay, great. So you think this is all about like you deciding something versus how we're actually doing it here. And you don't seem to recognize that. So where I've also seen success are folks who have a background in storytelling, because as a product manager, one of the things you have to do is pull together a lot of different threads to then create a narrative that drives an outcome. I also think that one has to have tenacity and, a little bit of fearlessness, because you're going to be saying no to a lot of people and you're going to be going into ambiguity and the unknown and trying to create that. And another product manager who joined our organization, there was some consternation when we were initially bringing her on board because she had no background in cybersecurity. And this was, I think that this was still when we were a bit myopic at our company about like, did you have to have a cybersecurity background? And, I was discouraged from bringing her on board. But during the interview process, I learned something really fascinating about her. She was born and raised in Hawaii, or she was raised in Hawaii most of her life. And on her island, she used to watch the planes come and go. And she was like, I want to get away from here. Believe it or not, she wanted to get away from Hawaii. And she was like, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to become an airline pilot. So when she had a chance to go to college, she went to Florida State, became a pilot. She was working for commercial jetliners. And she was like, you know what? It was so boring. I was just driving a bus in the sky, like, because I was asking her about this, and she was like, yeah, like, when it's, because I was like, oh my gosh, learning to be a pilot must have been scary. She's like, nah, you put the hood on your head and you land the plane without being able to see, and like, sometimes you land and the rain's coming at you and the plane's all over the place. I'm like, oh my God, that sounds awful. And she's like, no, that's the fun part. The problem with being a commercial jet pilot is that everybody wants it to be smooth and easy, and that's like so boring. And so I decided to go get my master's degree in computer science, because that seemed like a lot more challenging to me. And so she just totally changed after, being a commercial jet pilot, and went off and learned to become a computer scientist, and then went into product management, was doing supply chain management. When I met her, I'm like, I don't know that she has a background in cybersecurity, but this person has reinvented themselves multiple times in their lifetime. I'm pretty sure she's going to be fine. And sure enough, her onboarding took 9 months versus maybe a typical more 6 months of getting somebody like up to speed and delivering value. But now she's actually beloved at that organization, and she disappeared to go to a startup for about 6 months. And the moment we could hire back, she was hired back at like a much larger salary. She's still there to this day. Everyone was like, oh my gosh, we can't imagine being without her. And so for me, again, it's all about like looking at like different attributes that people might have that make a great product manager. And I think that people can come from anywhere, but most of the time I commonly see them coming from the engineering side of the house, because, that technical side of things gives them an advantage, at least to start with.
And something I've been really curious about is your current role. And so maybe let's start by telling us about the company, telling us about your role, but I'm going to circle back and talking about how you got there.
Sure. So can I ask you a question first?
For sure.
Well, two questions. First, do you know what a breach is?
I do know what a breach is.
Yep. So a breach, companies, getting broken into and its data installing. And on average, how many days do you think it takes for a company to detect that breach and then fix that breach?
Depending on the size of the company, I wouldn't be surprised if it took weeks to detect it and then months to rectify it.
Okay, so that's a very good answer. So the median answer I typically get is 2 weeks. I love it when people say 2 days, because I'm like, I want to be friends with you because you're super optimistic. Because the answer right now is about 270, 280 days,
and this is for recognition and rectifying
and solving the problem.
For the whole
it's like 72 days to like discover it. So think about that. Wow. You have at least like 2 months of somebody running around on your network doing nefarious things. And it used to be the case that, attackers would only go after larger organizations. But because information is currency now, every organization, no matter big or small, is a potential target. And so what we do at Blumira is we offer a cybersecurity platform that helps small businesses solve that problem. And I like to think of us as the QuickBooks of cybersecurity. So if you roll us out inside of your organization, you're going to have a really great cybersecurity platform that should protect you from most of those things in a cost-effective way. And the reason why I joined Blumira, so I was at Duo Security, and we were acquired by Cisco. That was a very exciting time. I'd spent my career working at startups. Duo was my fourth startup. And about 2 years into my experience at Cisco, a lot of what I was doing was helping integrate Duo into Cisco. I got the itch to go back to a startup because that's what I like to do. And Cisco's a great company, but it's a much larger company, and there are a lot, different processes there in terms of getting things done. And it was a lot harder for me to see the value of what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. And I thought a lot about, what am I good at? And I'm like, product management. But I didn't feel like I could be successful at product management the way I liked to be successful when I was at Cisco. And then, I thought a bit more, and I was like, I'm also good at starting companies or building companies. And there's not a lot of people who can do that and who've done it 4 times. So maybe I should go do that again. And Blumira was already in operating at the point. It was a couple of years old, and I knew the people over at Blumira, was aware of them, and in fact had talked to one of the original founders before I joined Duo Security about building what became Blumira 10 years prior. And at the time, he was somewhat reluctant to jump into making a product company. He'd run a services organization for a long time, and I was like, I think we'll need like 5 engineers in 2 years and we can make something great. And we just didn't speak the same language in terms of like expectations. He thought that was a lot. I actually was like, that's the cheap side of things. And so I went off to Duo and found success there. But when I re-engaged with the Blumira team, they had built something really amazing. And so when I saw where the product was, I was really excited because I was like, wow, this is delivering on a promise that's really hard. It's doing it in a way that's easy for people to understand. It needs a better route to market and some more solid product bones in it. And that's what I was good at. So I jumped in with both feet as the VP of product. And about a year into that journey, the board asked me to step into the role of the CEO position. Our former CEO is still on the board, still participates in the business. But my experience in terms of building out and working at startups was seen to be really valuable. So they asked me to step in and bring some of that to bear.
Are you the first non-founder CEO at Blumira?
That's right. Yep.
So that, I'm sure, like the last CEO had been there since day one. And so in terms of the linchpin factor to it, there's just a lot of inadvertent things I'm sure that they were doing. And in terms of transitioning to someone else, I'm sure had a lot of nuances and all the months and years that Blumira had been around. So what was that like? Was it already on the plan that the founder was going to transition to another CEO before, or that kind of start to show up after.
So here's the interesting thing about being somebody who is a non-founder CEO. You aren't really privy to any of the plans until you become the CEO. And oftentimes when you get moved into the CEO position, you discover that what you thought were plans may not have ever been written down or anything like that. So yes, it may have been in the cards, but I don't really know what the timeline was. I do think that our board was like, hey, this is a really great opportunity, so why don't we do this and move forward with it this way. Cool. From like my perspective, any transition in change management is challenging. And so, and it just depends on what are the things that you're trying to figure out and what are the things you're trying to do. And when you do leadership change at that level, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. But the way that we executed it at Blumira was with a lot of that in mind. And so I think it was a smooth transition for our stakeholders, maybe less smooth for me because there is no such thing as CEO training school. You may, if you're not a CEO, think that there's, like the Wizard of Oz, there's this control room with all of these levers and instruction manuals. And there's not. It's just a big white empty room that you as a CEO get to define what's going to happen and how it's all going to go down. And there's real opportunity in there. And then there's also some ambiguity that can be a little bit scary about that.
Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.